My name is Pam Dingle. I am one of a moderation team, myself and Abby. We are part of the program committee, and we're making sure that these talks are all on time and that there's lots of questions. And you can only have questions if you log into the app. So you need to be logged in. There's a Q&A section where you can ask. And that's going to be super important for this session, especially if you're watching online. So that's PSA number one. And then PSA number two is that there is a survey that you can do at the end. And we really value having your feedback on whether you saw value in the presentation. And it keeps these guys honest, so that's all right. Without further ado, I will turn it over to your panel. They're going to introduce themselves. Thank you.
Come on up, don't be shy. All right. Thank you. You all look comfortable, well hydrated, ready to start?
Too comfortable.
Okay, excellent. So we all have day jobs, all very exalted titles. But here today, we're wearing a different hat, which is coming together as a set of competitors to try to build something bigger than all of us together. So that's why we're so excited about it. We're here to talk about AuthEN. And I'll start by introducing myself, and I'll let each member here introduce themselves. I'm Omri Gazitt. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Aserto, which is an authorization company. I started my career in identity and access way back in the kind of early 2000s, working on things like SOAP and W security and W's Federation. Yes, I inflicted that upon the world, and later on helped start the Azure Active Directory project in Microsoft, and back now working on the authorization part of identity and access. Atul.
Thank you. So, like typical CTOs, we sit and let the CEO stand and do all the work. Right? Hi, I'm Atul Tulshibagwale. I'm CTO of Signal. We're a 3-year-old startup working in access management, zero standing privileges, and all that. And you can come talk to me afterwards if you want to know more. By way of background, before Signal, I was at Google. I worked on the BeyondCorp devices API, and one of the things I did when I was there was I wrote a blog, which I had no idea would be so popular, and the blog had, coined the term, continuous access evaluation protocol, or CAPE, and that became a thing. Afterwards, I started working on the standard with a bunch of great people, and that got merged into a parallel effort in the OpenID Foundation to form the Shared Signals Working Group, which I'm now co-chair of, and it's getting good traction in defining standards for session security, which is CAPE, and for account security, which is RISC, and now we're also seeing interest from SCIM, which is sort of the System for Cross-Domain Identity Management, and I thought I got that acronym right, and they are now a part of, they are also introducing a standard that can leverage the shared signals framework. So it's great to see that sort of blossom into a lot of different things. Before that, you can blame Omri for the WS star. You can blame me a little bit for SAML. I was one of the first people to in the Liberty Alliance project, and then all that work got rolled up into SAML, which I was kind of not in the meetings, but I was running a company, and my CTO was actually doing the work. And I've been in the security space forever. I was at VeriSign, one of the first few people there, building all the standards for OCSP and code signing and stuff like that. And have still not solved the problem, so I'm still working. So.
Nice. Thank you, Alex.
Hi, Alexandre Babeanu. Up until about a week ago, I was the CTO at 3Edges, but got acquired by Indicate, so now I'm the lead product manager for access management at Indicate.
Authorization moves quickly.
Startup words, interesting. Before that, I was consulting for a long time and worked at Oracle on the OIM product, OIM 11G, if you're familiar with that. Wrote pieces of that. But this is my first AuthEN, my first standard, so this has been an interesting journey so far.
not least, David.
Hi, so for those of you who were,
Mike?
can you hear me? Testing, testing. Yep. For those of you who were in the previous session, you already know me, and those of you who weren't in the previous session, where were you? My name is David. I've been involved with authorization for a good 15 years. I suffered through WS Star. Thank you very much, Anne-Marie.
Sorry.
And I helped co-write Zachmol and then Alpha later. The truth is, I'm also Alex's neighbor, so he was too afraid to come on his own today, so I just tagged along, you know.
I think it's not the other way around.
And I'm too young to know what Oracle means.
Good point. And I'm too old, I forgot.
Great. You know, obviously a lot of years of experience here represented on the panel, so glad to have everyone here. The format here is going to be, I'll be the MC and take you through some of the materials that we've prepared, but also engage each of these folks in some questions about why we, kind of focused on the places that we want to focus on with the spec, and hopefully we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A, probably 10 or 15 minutes easily. So first difference between authentication and authorization. This is the slide that David, if you went to his presentation, tried to crib. And that's what you get for stealing slides, my friend. It didn't quite work out for you, didn't it?
I thought it was hidden, though.
So authentication is, did the user prove that they are who they say they are? And how many of you know the logos on this left part of the slide? Pretty much everyone. And if you don't, then, you are here at the FIDO Alliance conference, WebAuthEN, CTAP, these are the defining technologies for FIDO. OAuth 2, OpenID Connect, these are other defining technologies for authentication. And the fact that everybody knows them means that we've largely been able to successfully solve the problem of authentication. How do you basically take the problem of getting all these websites to integrate with your SSO system, and how do you actually move from passwords to passwordless? These are important problems, but we've largely been able to move the industry forward. Now, authorization, by contrast, is now that you're logged in, what can the user do in the context of the application? How many of you know the logos on the right side of the slide? I see 1, 2, not very many hands up. And that's why we're here. Because we believe that authorization is next. That's the next hard problem for the IAM industry to go solve. I'll go through some of these logos in a little bit more detail in a couple of slides. But the focus of this presentation is AuthEN. AuthEN is a standard that we hope will succeed where a lot of these other ones have not quite gotten to escape velocity, if you will. So first, let's kind of talk contrast what modern authentication looks like in the context of what we know today, which is traditional authorization. Sorry, I meant authorization. And I want to talk about the what, the how, and the when. So with traditional authorization, you're typically trying to authorize at a coarse-grained level. Typically, it's when you have a tenant, you have viewer access to the tenant, right? That means that you can view anything inside of that tenant. How you authorize. So the way you typically build authorization logic is that you embed a bunch of questions, if and switch statements, inside of your code. We call this authorization spaghetti logic, inside of the relying party. And you typically check whether an authentication token, like a token, has a scope or a claim. And if that token has that scope or that claim, then that user has that permission on that resource. And that can get pretty hairy for a number of reasons that we'll get into in a second. And then when? When are permissions evaluated? Typically with traditional authorization, you're talking about at token issuance time. When you're logged in, you basically, the authentication ceremony, part of that is figuring out which scopes go into the access token, and then you mint that, and it's good for a couple of hours or a couple of days, and the relying party then actually uses that token to figure out whether you have permissions. And so modern authorization is really kind of moving us forward in all three of these dimensions. So The what is fine-grained as opposed to coarse-grained. The how is we move to policy-based. And the when, rather than doing it at login time, you're doing it in real time. So let's go through each one of these in turn. First, Alex, can you tell us a little bit about fine-grained access control? Why is it so important, and what are the scenarios that are enabled by fine-grained access control as opposed to coarse-grained?
Right, so it all depends on the actual resource you're trying to protect. So if the resource you're trying to protect is a generic thing, like just an API or a high-level web page or something, then you're talking about coarse-grain level access control. Fine-grain, you're going down to the data level. A good example put forward by Google actually is the Google Docs, for example. That's something that you own, that you want to share access in a fine-grained way. Another example would be database and data. Data can be very, very fine-grained, and access to that can be driven by complex rules. Now, as you see on the slide, there's various ways to enforce access control to these fine-grained elements. Whether it's A-back or reback or whatever, you have to first model in a way, or is it in a rule or something, you have to model that resource somehow. In reback system, which stands for relationship-based access control, you essentially use a graph of data that represents the subjects which are trying to access the resources. Everything's in this graph, and then you can find paths in the graph to determine access. It's A-back, I mean, we can enforce A-back through that means as well. You can model attributes as elements in the graph itself. On the other hand, you have the code aspect where you can actually express all the same things in rules. There are advantages and disadvantages of those, but we can get back to that, I guess, at a later point. But fine-grained access control is important because you want to be able to manage access to those very granular resources, essentially.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment there that, unlike in authentication, when you go to single sign-on, like with OpenID Connect or with SAML, you don't typically end up using sort of the proprietary single sign-on anymore, right? You've wholeheartedly moved to a new authentication model. Authorization is slightly different because there may be cases where you want to use RBAC, like for instance, who needs to have access to Gmail? Shouldn't have to be done using ABAC or EBAC or anything. It's just birthright access. You could do that using RBAC. But so it's when you talk about authorization, it could be more of a coexistence of different strategies, and you could choose the strategy based on what you're trying to do.
David, anything to add?
Yeah, just to Atul's point, when we say fine-grained, the goal of the framework is to be able to go all the way to fine-grained. But of course, it does not preclude what you did in the past. And like doing basic access management, web access management, the act of saying, oh, a regular employee can get access to Gmail, and that could be role-based, right? You don't need fine-grained authorization for that. And then if you want to say a finance employee can view the purchasing system, that's also a role. You don't need to be fine-grained. And then to Alex's point, once you're inside of the purchasing system, maybe you can only view POs for the state you live in, and maybe you can only approve POs for a certain amount. That's where the fine-grained comes into play.
So really, there's a continuum here. So as you get finer and finer grained, you need to be able to employ new techniques, the techniques of modern authorization.
Yep.
Great.
This is where it breaks down usually. People keep using roles all the way to the very granular level, which leads to role explosion and to the fact
That's
that...
right. I have a story I like to tell. Back when I left Microsoft, this was in late 2011, we had roughly 100,000 employees. And how many groups do you think we had in AD?
A million?
300,000. So 3 groups for every person.
Only those many? But just wanted to bring up one more thing, which we all take for granted, which is actually getting popular again, unfortunately, which is ACLs, right? Because with the existence of cloud systems, we end up with this kind of non-role based, like just fundamental ACLs, access control lists. And that is something that you might still need for the highest level of protection, but just wanted to make sure that we also talk about that.
Yep, for sure. Let's move on to policy-based. And I know, David, you're very passionate about that. You gave a whole talk about policy-based systems. So this transition from expressing your authorization in code to externalizing your authorization, expressing it as a policy. Tell us why that's so important.
Yeah, so the number one reason I used to think, and if you saw my presentation, it's no longer the only reason, but the number one reason you want to do externalized authorization is to prove that you're compliant, to be able to run audits. So what you want to do is, instead of having code that implements authorization in an opaque way in your app, and mind you, your app could be in many different languages, because of course you have hundreds and hundreds of apps. Instead of doing that, you're going to have authorization expressed as configuration. Generally speaking, for me, that configuration is policy. Some of us in this room like to think graph is better than policy. Let them think what they want to think. But joke aside, the bottom line, what you want to do is whatever config format you choose, a graph or a policy. And when you say policy, like I said earlier, there's different languages that you can use for policy. Atul, Alex, and I used our own languages that are very similar. It doesn't matter as long as you can take that policy language, turn to the auditor and say, hey, auditor, this is what I did. And then as long as you can run access reviews on those policies, as long as you can run audit checks, as long as you can recertify your policies, then you're in a good place. There's other benefits too, by the way. It's not just audit. It could be the fact that you can update the policy to accommodate for new scenarios. So this is more on the user experience or the developer experience side of things. The fact that you can adapt to new legislation as well. So that's why doing configuration-driven or policy-driven authorization is much cleaner, transparent, visible, and safer than the alternative, which is being hard-coded in the application.
Anything else to add?
Yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
Policy also enables you to centralize those access policies much easier than, like, for example, writing your own spaghetti code or even using ACLs, where it's really hard to manage centrally. So depending also on who should build those policies, there's a spectrum there as well, I think. Policy would be more for a centralized scenario.
I mean, I'd just like to add that, one of the things that you get with policy-based access control is consistency, right? Because you may have different groups, like different roles that are being applied to different applications, and you don't have a consistent enforcement as a result of that, because application A might refer to a different role, application B might refer to a different role, different memberships. And it also makes the access reviews or access certification much easier, because with policy-based access control, you're essentially certifying a rule that may not actually translate into like individual access permissions, right? It's just a statement of how somebody may or may not get access. Whereas when you're doing access reviews with rules or groups, it's first of all a point-in-time review where those memberships may have changed after you did those reviews, right? And so as a result, what you get with policy-based access control is actually much more current and much simpler than with role-based.
Yeah. One thing to add, I would add, is by externalizing authorization, you achieve some measure of separation of concerns, separation of duties. And this is kind of a tried and true technique in computer science, create another layer of abstraction. If we think about configuration as code, the idea back in 10 or 15 years ago of the whole founding of the DevOps movement was about being able to express the configuration of all your software components in a textual language and be able to apply that configuration consistently across a bunch of different nodes. Infrastructure as code, if you look at that, it allows DevOps teams to be able to likewise treat their entire infrastructure in a very precise way, specify it as infrastructure as code. And policy as code is kind of the next turn of that crank, so to speak. It also allows these teams, the security teams, to really think about the policy holistically, to be able to apply base layers of policy across all the different services, but then allow specific targets of authorization to specify their own domain-specific pieces of that. And then the last piece of this is real-time, the real-time aspect. I know, Atul, you're very passionate about zero standing privileges and zero trust. Tell us a little bit about why that's so important.
Sure. I mean, we're used to a system where you're doing a lot of elaborate verification of the access policy at the time of login. but those login sessions then can go on for a really long time. And the conditions that were present at the time when you establish that that user may have access to that particular system can change at any time, right? Without the user actually doing any action, maybe as a result of the user doing some action. And so you need some way in which that updated information can be continuously evaluated to see if that user's access should still be there, should that user access be removed, and whether their assurance level can be changed, whether what they have access to within the application can be changed, and all those things, right? So these are the things that you can do now with things like the shared signals framework and the continuous access evaluation profile on top of the shared signals framework. And so that's what I think is going to be very important going forward, because we don't want a situation where you're issuing tokens every hour because you cannot trust what happens after that token was issued. So you should be able to issue much longer lived tokens, but be able to revoke the access as and when you need that.
Great. Anything to add?
Yeah, this comes a lot into play when you use authorization at the time of login, when you stuff the access token with a bunch of claims so that the resources then can read those claims and enforce access themselves. Well, imagine if a claim is not valid anymore because something changed. Maybe you need to remint the token or something needs to happen. That's where the shared signal protocol and framework comes into play. It's interesting. Yeah, sorry.
I think, Atul, you're pointing to also an area where a lot of applications today are token-based or token-biased, and the theoretical architecture and externalized authorization is this notion that you have a PEP and a PDP, but the theory sometimes having a PEP for every single app may not always be possible, so you have to marry those places where you can have a PEP PDP, like the theory says, and those places where you will still live with tokens, but they will be augmented by things like CAPE and RISC, absolutely, to make them more adaptive.
Yeah.
And if we look at, just to kind of pull some of this stuff together, if we look back at the Google Drive or Google Docs scenario, that scenario is extremely hard to achieve with just token issuance that has a set of claims in it. When you're logging in, Google doesn't really compute at login time what documents you have access to, right? Because if it did, first of all, it would be a computationally intensive thing to do. It would take a long time. But as soon as it minted that access token, it would be stale, because as soon as you logged in, the next second, somebody could have revoked access to one of those documents. The only real architecture that enables that is an architecture where the relying party, in this case, the Drive application like Google Docs, will find out there and then, does this user have this permission on this particular resource, in this case, a document. And so there's a spectrum here where for some scenarios, having a token that is long-lived is fine, especially if that token can be revoked or reissued if some underlying condition changes, like a user gets removed from a group. But for some scenarios, there's no recourse other than having a policy decision point that computes whether a user has access to that particular resource.
I think we all agree that we want to get to that dynamic just-in-time authorization, though. That's kind of the dream nirvana state of where we'd like to get, because that's where zero trust lies. You want to always verify, and it's always real-time, and it's externalized and dynamic. But long is the road, I guess, and we need to have.
Right.
I think one way to think about it is that all access decisions are based on state, right? So there's some state that you're referring to which determines whether or not that user should have access to that particular resource or not. Now that state you can dynamically update and query and find out what is the current state at the time of access. I think you need that always, but the question is then how does that state get updated, right? Now if you're taking the Google example, right, if I go into Google and I change the permissions on a file, every access is going to check those permissions right there, right, because it's all within the Google universe of things. Whereas what happens is if, let's say, your state is coming from some other system, right, like let's say somebody's working on a ticket, like you know, like a customer service agent is working on a particular case, right? And that case has a certain state that because of which that person has got access to the resource. Now, when that state changes, it's not going to be possible always to go back to that system and check the state, right? So you need a way to convey that information continuously to the point where you know, you want to enforce the access. Right, and that I think is the difference we're talking about, where the PDP and PEP case, you're relying on a policy information point that is going to give you the latest state. But the question is, how do you update that policy information point? And that I think can be done using asynchronous communication like in the shared signals framework.
So we have 30 minutes left, so I'm going to move us you know, quickly through here. A little bit about, I'm going to gloss over this very quickly here. There are really two ecosystems that have emerged here, and you could probably hear that in, you know, the manner in which my various colleagues are answering the questions. There is a stateful and a stateless ecosystem. The stateless ecosystem started out with ABAC and XACML, expresses policy as code. The other one is, you know, has evolved around the graph or relationship-based access control innovations, and you know, you could think of it as expressing policy as data. On the left side, we have a set of specifications that have kind of contributed on the ABAC side. On the right side, we have some of the you know, happenings in the industry, especially the Zanzibar paper the Google issued in 2020, where they wrote about how they built their planet-scale authorization system that have influenced the evolution of that ecosystem. AuthEN tries to take a big tent. It's the first effort in the industry, and this will be a good transition into talking about AuthEN, where we're trying to unify both of these camps together. And if it wasn't enough innovation, all of these projects, how many of you know any of the logos on the bottom half of the slide here? Yeah, there are quite a few.
How many of you know any of the logos minus Open Policy Agent?
A smaller number, yes. So there's a ton of innovation that's happening in the space, and it's dizzying. It's very hard to keep track of all the ABAC and all the reback and the things in the middle, like Topaz that try to do both. It's very difficult to go figure out you know, kind of how to learn and interact with all of these. And the idea behind AuthEN is to try to give you a single interface that allows you to talk to all of these open source systems, as well as any of the proprietary systems that you know, speak those languages.
I just want to add, Amri, on the previous slide, is that these different frameworks and these different standards, they might not all come from the same place. So Zanzibar, for instance, they were really focused on consistent access control at scale. It wasn't really about fine-grained access control or policy-driven authorization. It was the fact that you have Google Drive around the world, and you got to make sure that if you share a document in North Carolina, it's shared in exactly the same way in China, right? So that was authorization at scale, consistent authorization at scale. And we can learn from that, right? The ZACWL and the NGAC and the Alpha people, they were more about we need fine-grained access control, and it needs to be policy-based. We can learn from that, and so on and so forth. We can each bring something to the table. OPA was way more about infrastructure, for instance. So all great lessons to learn.
We're going to move a little bit forward because we're a little behind on where I thought we would be on the panel, and I want to leave some time for questions. So let's talk a little bit about the AuthEN charter. I want to first you know, call on David to give a little bit, you know, a 1 minute origin story on AuthEN and where we came from.
1 minute. How much time do we have? Once upon a time, in a city not too far away called Las Vegas, a bunch of people got together, I think it was 2022 originally, and said, okay, we're done with authentication, we've solved authentication, we've got no issues with passwords anymore, let's do something different. And they looked and they were like, well, authorization is kind of, you know, we need to figure that out. Nothing happened. In 2023, we got together again, and this time, through the fact that there were more parties around the table, more use cases around the table, we got together and we said, okay, You, Topaz, you speak one way of doing authorization, and you Signal a different way, and you 3Edges indicate a different way, and you Axiomatics a different way. What if we all spoke the same language, at least the same way of asking a question, the same way of getting an answer back? I mean, after all, authorization is just about saying, hey, can you do this? Yes, you can. No, you can't. Can we just standardize that? And that's how AuthEN came to be. Like the number one goal was to standardize on the request response so that we could all interoperate between us.
And I do want to call out Atul catalyzed this, kind of current generation of efforts by putting out a candidate spec. There's nothing like actually having something to critique to bring a set of interested parties together. So there are really three areas that we want to focus on with AuthEN. The first one is the PEP to PDP API. The second one is event delivery. And then the third one is policy discovery and management. So Alex, why did we decide to focus first on the PEP PDP scenario?
Well, PEP PDP is, to us, I mean, it's the lowest hanging fruit. It's the simplest thing we could do. PEP, the policy enforcement point, can really be anything. It can be an API gateway. It can be an if-then clause in your code. It could be a proxy. It could be an authorization server in OAuth. But that communication to the PDP is really the simplest thing we could standardize. If we can have a standard protocol there, then we can easily interchange any PDP from any PEP, really. So that's essentially it. So to have early success.
Yep, and low-hanging fruit. And amazingly, in roughly a year since we've started the AuthEN working group, we have a number of interoperable implementations. I won't spoil the fun to the last slide, but let's then talk about, I think the next one is Atul. Why is event delivery interesting as a follow-on?
Yeah. Well, I mean, like I was saying earlier, like you need the state to be updated in the PDP all the time, and that can be done using event delivery. I love this slide because it shows how complex this whole authorization space is, and that we have to chip at it with like a lot of effort, because single sign-on feels relatively easy now. With as compared to this is going to be a much bigger beast to tame. And I think starting with the PDP PEP was a great point. Now, hopefully in the future you'll be able to just drop in PEPs from different, like you might get an application that just says, hey, just point me to your PDP and it'll all work, right? And that's kind of where you want to get to. And so, just from the event delivery point of view, I think I've made the point in the previous spec, so I don't need to go over it again. So.
And David, how about policy discovery and management? Why is that important to go?
Yeah, so I want to bounce back on what you said, Atul, that it's a complex landscape. I think, technically speaking, authorization is super easy. The plumbing, the PEP, the PDP, super simple. The hard stuff is the human element. And what I mean by that is, now you need to have someone write policy. But policy is not just identity data, it's also resource data, right? So it's not like you can go to the IAM team and say, hey, can you write me this policy? Well, no, it depends on the finance system. It depends on the blueprint system, whatever it may be you're protecting, right? But that's why it matters. You want to engage the business analysts, the product owners, so that you can write the policies with them, the policies that matter to your application, and then inherit policies that might have to do with legislation, GDPR, or the fact that you don't do business with Russia these days, or things like that, right? But that's also the beauty of it, because if you can collect all these policies together, you can reuse them across your apps, and then you can go back to what we said earlier about audit and compliance.
Great. So the takeaway here is that there's a lot of surface area to go after. We're attacking the, kind of the low-hanging fruit first. But this is probably a 5 to 10 year mission over, for the industry. Just to, kind of focus a little bit like on what is, like things that are more concrete here. This is what AuthEN 1.0 implementer's draft payload looks like. Now, we're not quite ratified as an implementer's draft from the OpenID Foundation. We thought originally that we would get there by this conference. It turns out that we're expected to be there around mid-November. But the payload is very simple. It has a subject, an action, a resource, and optional context. And that fully specifies what an access decision looks like. and the response payload can be very simple as well. It's a decision that's either true or false. So as you can see, very simple. And if you look at the many PDP implementations that have actually participated in the interop, every one of them has a different protocol for achieving the same purpose. So being able to standardize on a single message exchange pattern across all these PDPs really helps reduce a lot of the burden that developers have to undertake to learn how to interact with each of these frameworks. Instead, they can learn one payload structure, just like OpenID Connect really simplified how developers could interact with a single sign-on system. And then very briefly about the interop scenario. Now, a brief foreshadowing, tomorrow we're actually going to do a live interop event. I think it's at 4 o'clock.
Yep, 4 p.m.
Not exactly sure which room. It's open to everyone, but it's going to be a working session. We have a to-do application, so interops are notoriously boring. You're running a test suite with a bunch of assertions against all of these different backends, and you want to make sure that all of them pass the assertion suite. Well, we do that, but we also want to have fun. We wanted to define a kind of a whimsical to-do scenario where you have a set of actors, and they have various permissions within the system, and you're able to visualize through a to-do application whether a user can actually create to-dos or complete or delete to-dos on behalf of their own to-dos or other users. So this is what our interop use case looks like, and the architecture for the interop application is also fairly simple. Let me see if I can find the slide for that. Maybe not. Here we go. Great. So, we just basically, this happens to be, can people see this? I don't think so. Let me get out of the PowerPoint here for a second. I think that's the trick. Here we go.
Ooh, nice.
There we go. So this happens to, describe, how one implementation, the Topaz implementation does it. Some people have a proxy in front of their PDPs, some people don't. But the idea is that you have a set of users that are able to, send that particular payload to a wide variety of PDPs. And this is what the app looks like in action. So we have a set of to-dos here. We have two, protagonists here. Who's familiar with a Rick and Morty cartoon? Anyone? A few. So this is kind of a cartoon that's popular with nerds, with computer nerds. It has a evil genius named Rick, who's the grandfather, and Morty is his grandson, who's often his sidekick. And Morty can go create to-dos, like for example, we can go create a to-do, test the Cerbos implementation. And Morty is able to complete and delete his own to-dos, but of course he can't do that for Rick's. So if he tries to delete Rick's, he can't do that. And each of the compliant implementations basically implements either the 1.1 preview, the 1.0 implementer's draft, or a previous version of this. So this is kind of a fun way to try to play around with these things. So for example, the signal implementation can actually go test the, we can complete to-dos with any of these implementations here. And then if we log out and log in as Rick, Rick, since he's an evil genius and he has all the properties, all the roles to be able to complete anyone's to-dos, he can go delete any of these, not just his own, but also Morty's as well. So this is kind of not quite a real-life scenario, but a fun way of visualizing what authorization looks like. And we have a set of implementations that are compliant with various stages of the spec. Tomorrow, we're going to do an interop around the 1.1 spec, which adds the idea of boxcarring, sending multiple requests in a single request response interaction.
I think the amount of progress that this AuthEN working group has done in the short span that it's been around, it's great, right? So thanks, Omri and David, and whoever are the co-chairs of this group, right? I do feel like one of the limitations we have today is that it's more PDP heavy than the PEP, right? And which is why what you're seeing here is a toy application. What I would really hope for in the future is where there are real applications that are actually using real PDPs, and we're able to show interoperability between real applications and PDPs.
Yep.
So if you have your favorite applications that you would like to see implemented in a sort of application independent authorization way, I would encourage you to ask those companies, vendors, implementers to participate in AuthEN and to be able to do interoperability.
Yeah, you're stealing the call to action at the end of this this deck.
Come to the interop.
But I'll second that, right?
Yeah.
This is a call out to the Workdays and the Salesforces and the SAPs of this world, and the Oracles even, to implement AuthEN.
There's a few around.
If they're still around.
Yeah, they are.
I think they're still
So
around.
just to bring this to a close so we have plenty of time for Q&A, we have, this slide is actually out of date. We now have Ping Authorize as one of the interoperable implementations that happened last week. But plenty of folks that are participating. I see Alex here from Cerbos in the crowd. So a lot of great work has been done not just on creating a theoretical spec, but actually implementing it in various P2P products. So what's next? Let's briefly talk about the evaluations API that we're working on in 1.1. David, do you want to take us through that?
Yeah, so the next step for the API, which we're working on tomorrow at 4 p.m., like you said, is box scarring. So it's the whole idea that when you send an authorization request, why not send 2 or 10 in one go, right? So instead of saying, hey, can Alice view record 1, what if you could say, can Alice view, edit, delete record 1? Or maybe say, can Alice, Bob, Carol view, edit, delete record 1, right? So that's box scarring, multiple requests in one go. We have the draft spec for it. It's very non-controversial because it's just an extension on how you do the simple PEP PDP. But there's other APIs, and I don't know, Atul, if you want to touch on search.
He's going to talk about that, yeah. I would say I would take a little bit of issue with a non-controversial. It took us 2 months to decide whether we wanted to specify evaluations as an array or as a map. But
True.
So
There's
there are
details.
ergonomics, when it comes to technical people, various reasonable people may have different opinions, but we actually ended up getting there, which I'm happy
And
about.
since you bring it up, something that we really paid attention to. So if you look at Zacmol as an example, Zacmol had all of that already. So why reinvent the wheel? I think we want to make it easier on the PEP. That was a really strong driving force. And one of the reasons why it took us 2 months to get to the multi-request thing is that one of the proposals that we had inspired by Zacmol would have put a lot of work on the PEP to sort of correlate the original request with the eventual response. The proposal that we have now makes the PEP so much more lightweight. You just call the PDP, you get the responses, and you hit the ground running.
So Atul, do you want to take us through resource and subject
sure.
search?
I mean, it's kind of a generalization of the evaluations API, because in the evaluations API, you're specifying the subject, the action, the resource, and the conditions, right? Whereas in the resource search API, you're just specifying the subject and the action, and then you're saying, what resources can this subject perform, right? Same thing with subject search. You're specifying the resources, but you want to know which subjects have access to this resource. In real life, this can actually be very meaningful because you need these kinds of queries to be asked from time to time, and without these, you may end up getting some very powerful tokens that you're using in your application, and it leads to a pretty big attack vector where, let's say you have an Active Directory token that you're using to access, this information, right? If something goes wrong with that application, that token gets stolen, now you're out with a very powerful token, which can cause a lot of damage. So an API like this can help mitigate that, the amount of access that you're giving all your applications. And that's why this is important.
Yeah. Incredibly important for governance questions.
That's
like
right, yeah, I was about to say.
Which resources does Alex have access to? Or for this resource, which users have access to that? Those are very important, powerful questions. They're a close cousin of authorization, and it turns out that many authorization systems can answer those questions. And so we want to do that in an interoperable fashion. So just to close here, our calls to action for the group are to create additional interop scenarios that go beyond just the toy scenario. We want to have more representation from more PDPs, especially reback-focused PDPs. We have a small number of them. We have a couple of reback implementations that have signed up to actually go build the spec support in Q4 from some very big vendors. So we're very excited about that. We can't quite tip the hat on that yet. But most importantly here is work with relying parties to externalize authorization. So wouldn't it be great if your Salesforce, if your Workday, if your ServiceNow, if all the tools that your employees are working with day in, day out could actually participate in this externalized authorization world? That's where we need to be, and we don't have enough of these relying parties that are represented. We'd like to get your help to get more of them to come and play with us. And before we get into Q&A, we have about 9 minutes for Q&A. These are some links on where to find us. Sorry, no QR codes. These slides were created a little bit in a hurry, but take a quick picture of these, and if you want to come and participate in the AuthEN mailing list or working group sessions, all you have to do is go to those URLs and you'll find out how. So with that, 3 questions.
Thank you. Perfect. There's 3 questions online.
I'll go sit down now.
Yeah, no, gosh. Yeah, you can actually. You can now.
Thank
you.
For 9 minutes.
So these are coming through the app. Anyone here can use the app, or you can step up to the mic, whatever you prefer. But please use the mic, because otherwise people online can't hear. All right, so question number 1. Any pointers on centralized versus decentralized versus hybrid of both?
Ooh, I think I have some passion around this topic.
Me too. You
okay,
go.
I think all of us are.
Yeah, I'll try to go quick. So there really is a continuum here, right? So it really depends on how fast you want an answer from your authorization system. There are systems that really need answers in, let's call it, 1 to 10 milliseconds. If that's your latency budget, you have a B2B SaaS app, it needs to make decisions very quickly. You really need a decentralized authorization system. You need to be able to make those decisions, essentially deploy that PDP, that policy decision point, either inside of your app, which is what happens today, or kind of compiled in with your app, or at the very least as a sidecar that gets deployed on the same node as your app. That's the only way you're going to get to a millisecond of latency. Then there are some use cases, like when you're logging in, let's go find out all the scopes that you can put in an access token. That can take you a second, and that's fine to be centralized. So there's really a lot of different use cases. And the good news is that you can actually have a single technology that gives you the breadth of both of these scenarios. That's the nice thing about having technologies that are kind of can act both centralized and decentralized. The important part on this, regardless of where the decision point is, whether it's deployed right next to your app or deployed as a microservice, you want centralized control of all your policies. And so having managed centrally but enforce kind of locally, that's a precept that I think is very important for an authorization architecture.
So I'd like to add to that, if I may, the control part. Sometimes you want to actually delegate some form of control so that local development teams can build their own policies near their app. So this is where future work of AuthEN will come into play, where we'll be able to move those policies around so we can spread them and replicate them and all of that. But we do see use cases where developers want control over their own policies, but at the same time, it'd be great to be able to still answer the questions, who can access what, and etc.
Yeah, I think to wrap it all up, when you say centralized PAM, it could be, the control plane, what we called the PAP earlier, it could be the decision-making and the enforcement. It's quite clear that decision-making and enforcement, it all depends on what kind of performance you want to have and flexibility, so on and so forth. And the cool thing with the ABAC architecture is that these 3 elements are so loosely coupled that you can pretty much do whatever you want to do. Then the control plane, to Alex's point, there's a whole dimension of collaboration, right? You may want to let teams do whatever they want to do. You bought authorization for the sake of developer efficiency. You don't care about audit or access reviews or whatever. Just let your developers do whatever they want to do. So they need to be able to.
It's not exactly what I said.
No.
Still should be able
the first part.
Yeah.
Just let your developers do whatever they want to do is developer efficiency. And then there's the access review piece,
right.
where you want the auditors to be able to come in and slurp in all the policies and then do the audits.
Yeah, I would like to say, centralized policy, consistent decisions, and continuous enforcement.
Yeah.
Makes sense. All right, we got another one come in. This is awesome. So next one is, how do we compromise on SLA, which I assume is service level agreement, with real-time authorization evaluation?
So I think this speaks to the previous question, which is, all right, so why don't we have all these cloud services for authorization the same way that we have Okta and Auth0 and all these other things for authentication? And with authentication, it's a one-shot thing, right? Like you're basically making a call to an IDP, you get back a token. That ceremony can take 500 milliseconds or a second or however long it takes. Like it's not going to, unless it's like 10 or 20 seconds, it's not going to like largely affect the user experience of your application. But authorization happens in the critical path of every application request. And that's why you don't really see in the wild an architecture where you make a network round trip across the internet to find out whether a user has this permission on this resource. That's why you end up with these hybrid architectures where the enforcement happens very close to the application, but the management can happen with a control plane, and is not in the critical path of the application request.
What I would like to say is that it's not that when you have a standard like AuthEN that you're suddenly going to separate the cloud instance of your application from your policy decision point. It could both be in the same sort of cloud instance with a very low latency between them. It's just that they're following a standard protocol so that you can replace the PDP and you can replace the policy enforcement point and not have to change your policies.
And one more thing quickly, a lot of my customers, they come up to me and they go, oh, the performance is not going to fly, kind of to the point you're saying. I want to argue that when you do authorization within your app, when you write code to do checks, I mean, hopefully you do write code to do checks. It's not that your app is naked right now. You have a cost. When you decouple that, and it was true of authentication too, by the way, when you did authentication in the app, there was a cost too. When you decouple that from the app, you get to see that cost. Yeah, authorization is not free, but it wasn't free before. Now you can see how much it costs you, so you can actually make it better. You can actually enhance it. And I think at worst, you'll be on par, and at best, you can actually make your app behave better with decoupled externalized authorization.
But I think it's very important to note, you can absolutely deliver externalized authorization within your SLAs for your request.
Yeah, I think hopefully we made that point.
Okay, last question, and you can wrap it up and take it home.
Yep.
Do you expect that AuthEN will be used in consumer business domains? I thought this was basically aiming for enterprise use case.
Yes. Yes, I think it touches on Mac versus DAC, meaning that AuthEN, we kind of spoke a lot about like enterprise use cases, but at the end of the day, when you externalize authorization, it could be about enterprise policies like a manager can view a bank account, that sort of stuff, but it could also be about discretionary access control, DAC, where I, David, want to share my bank account data with Alex. Why? I don't know, but...
Well, there are very, kind of specific scenarios here. For example, banks are starting to, even for their consumer divisions, they're starting to have different roles, like, an accountant role or a bookkeeper role. Not just on business accounts. They're sharing scenarios across families, for example. So, I think that the business scenarios are much more, pressing, and therefore that's where we focused in terms of the use cases. But we've definitely talked to folks who look at the problem more widely and want to apply that pattern even for their consumer-facing properties.
The spec itself doesn't enforce anything. We just have a subject type and a subject ID. Subject type could be anything. Could be a customer, could be a device, could be an IoT thing, could be a robot, could be a web service. So it doesn't really specifically enforce anything for the enterprise, in my sense.
Yep.
Great.
All right, well,
Thank you.
We managed to get this done in, with 20 seconds to spare. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.